The sleek black Rolls-Royce turned onto the stone-paved drive leading into the Royce estate, its tires gliding silently over gravel, leaving behind faint silver dust in the late afternoon light. Through the car window, Celeste leaned slightly to glance at the old three-story house, its facade wrapped in purple ivy and topped with aged yin-yang roof tiles. Her face remained perfectly composed, but the slight twitch at the corner of her lips, too subtle for Nathaniel to notice, betrayed a quiet sense of disappointment. Nathaniel Royce. Her husband sat beside her, hands loosely clasped on his knee, eyes gazing distantly out the window. For the first time in 8 years, he was returning to his birthplace, not as the privileged young heir, but as the sole inheritor of Royce Holdings and a married man. "The house is older than I imagined," Celeste remarked, her voice light, but not entirely neutral. Nathaniel only nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Still standing after nearly 2 centuries. You'll get used to it." Celeste didn't reply. She had pictured something grander, modern, with an intelligent lighting system, minimalist interiors, a gym, and a heated pool. But this place felt more like walking into a living museum. When the car stopped at the large stone-paved portico, a long row of staff stood waiting in neat formation. Nathaniel recognized a few familiar faces among the uniformed faces, Chef Margot, Old Gardener Wills. But his gaze paused longest on the woman standing at the very end, slightly behind the others. Quiet, yet her stillness made her stand out more than anyone. Agnes. Her hair was whiter than when they last met. Her sun-worn hands were clasped before her, her frame thin but sturdy like an old tree. But her eyes still warm, still the same eyes that once looked at little Nathaniel with love. The boy who used to run to her whenever his father spoke too harshly, who'd sneak into the kitchen to hear her tell fairy tales on cold winter nights. "Agnes," Nathaniel whispered, and stepped out of the car without waiting for the driver to open the door. He walked straight toward her. As the distance closed, Agnes smiled gently. "You're home, Nathaniel." "I'm home," he answered, and as if the years had melted away, he embraced her unreservedly. The familiar scent of lavender from her scarf hit him like a wave. Memories he thought long buried came crashing back in a tide of emotion. Celeste stepped out of the car just in time to witness the scene. She froze, raising an eyebrow. Who was her husband hugging? She wasn't used to seeing Nathaniel like this, soft, emotional, and affectionate. With a housekeeper, Celeste, Nathaniel called as he pulled away from Agnes, one hand still gently resting on her shoulder. "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Agnes. She raised me. She's part of this family." Celeste smiled. The curve of her lips was perfect, her eyes politely bright, a smile polished over hundreds of charity galas and corporate conferences. "Pleasure to meet you, Agnes." Celeste extended her hand gracefully, but it was cold. The handshake lasted barely a second. Agnes nodded slightly. "Hello, miss. Thank you for bringing Nathaniel home." Celeste smiled again. "I've been looking forward to this visit." Nathaniel didn't notice, or chose not to, how Celeste's eyes skimmed past Agnes, as one would glance at an old object needing replacement. But James, Nathaniel's cousin standing nearby, saw it, and Marjorie, the quiet aging aunt, saw it too. As the three entered the grand foyer, the last rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting brilliant colors onto the marble floor. But a darker cloud had begun to gather for those who witnessed it. No one said it aloud, but the conflict had already started. The first night at the Royce estate passed in outward quiet, but beneath the surface, in the hearts of each person, silent waves had already begun to stir. Celeste lay on her side atop the enormous rosewood bed, moonlight filtering through hand-embroidered curtains, casting pale reflections across her porcelain skin. She was not asleep. The room felt suffocating with its high-ceiling vintage floral wallpaper and a walnut bookcase nearly reaching the top. It wasn't like the five-star hotels or luxurious penthouses she was used to. It smelled of the past, and she did not belong there. On the other side of the bed, Nathaniel slept. His chest rose and fell steadily, one hand resting lightly on the blanket. She watched him for a long time. That man, gracious, successful, wealthy, was everything Celeste had ever desired. But she had never imagined that marrying him would also mean inheriting a world she could not control. Like Agnes, that old housekeeper, she wasn't just a servant. She had sat at the dinner table with the entire family, sat beside Aunt Marjorie across from James, directly opposite Celeste. Celeste had been surprised, no shocked, but she didn't show it. She tilted slightly, smiled politely, and sliced into her lamb silently. But in her mind, every behavior was recorded, every glance, every murmur between Agnes and Nathaniel, each dry inked into her memory like permanent marks. No one said it aloud, but Agnes's place in this household was more than that of a servant. The next morning, when Celeste came downstairs to the breakfast room, the table had already been set. Marjorie sat reading the paper. James stirred his coffee, and Agnes, in her pearl gray uniform, was pouring Earl Grey tea for each person, unhurried, unapologetic. Every movement she made seemed to light up the kitchen, as if led by an invisible conductor. "Do you take honey or sugar?" Celeste Agnes asked gently, not overly familiar, but not distant either. "Sugar," Celeste replied slowly, her eyes quietly observing. Nathaniel entered moments later, his hair slightly tousled from oversleeping. He took in the scene, Agnes pouring tea for his wife, and smiled. "Just like old times. You still like having tea in the morning with my scones, don't you?" Agnes turned to him, her gaze warm, as if they shared a secret from childhood. Celeste set her teacup down softly. "Seems like you've kept a lot of old habits," she remarked. Nathaniel missed the nuance in her tone, but James, always sensitive to undercurrents, smiled his trademark half-smile worn by men who enjoy watching the drama unfold. "Did you know," James suddenly said, "Agnes once punished Nathaniel by banning chocolate pudding for 3 days because he broke her teapot?" Everyone laughed. Even Marjorie cracked a small smile. Nathaniel blushed but laughed along. Only Celeste didn't laugh. She stared at Agnes like someone watching a play they hadn't been invited to act in. After breakfast, Celeste strolled the main hallway. The walls were lined with oil paintings of the Royce ancestors, men with beards draped in red velvet robes, swords in hand, standing beside maps or war horses. In the center hung a smaller black and white photograph. At 8 years old, Nathaniel sits in an armchair with a storybook in his lap and stands behind him. Agnes. She stared at that picture, her expression gradually turning unreadable. Then she returned to the bedroom and unlocked her phone. A draft message blinked on the screen. "That woman needs to be dealt with. Soon." She stared at the line for a long time, then deleted it. Not yet. There was still time to shift things, but it was enough for her to know that woman was a shadow that needed to be removed. That evening, dinner was held in the West Hall, a space rarely used since Mrs. Royce passed away. As always, Agnes personally oversaw the kitchen. The menu featured roasted veal with wild mushroom sauce, creamy carrot soup, and a classic dessert, nutmeg custard tart, a dish Nathaniel had adored since childhood. Celeste knew all of this. Not because Nathaniel had told her, but because she had discovered an old recipe notebook tucked between storage boxes in the library. Agnes's handwriting, the ink faded with age, beside a note that read, "For Nat when he's sad." That afternoon, Celeste stood by the dining room door for a long time, watching Agnes command the kitchen staff, as if she, not Celeste, the legally wedded wife, was truly running the house. When everyone had gathered at the table, the mood seemed pleasant enough at first. Marjorie talked about replanting lavender in the south garden. James made snide remarks about the young investors he'd met in London. Celeste sat quietly, lightly tracing the rim of her wine glass. Something in her gaze dimmed each time Agnes passed by to refill water or replace cutlery. Nathaniel, cheerful and unaware, said to his mother, "Figure, Agnes, this tart tastes exactly like it used to. Just missing one thing, you're not making me do the math before I get to eat it." Laughter broke out. Even Marjorie smiled. Agnes tilted her head and replied gently, "Well, you're grown now. I don't need to watch over you. But I still remember the pout on your face when you didn't get your dessert." Celeste smiled for the first time that evening, but it wasn't a warm smile. "You must have been quite a child, in needing very particular discipline." Agnes looked up but said nothing. Nathaniel didn't catch the undertone, simply nodding. "I'm lucky to have had her. Otherwise this house might have swallowed me whole." And then it happened in a moment that seemed harmless. Agnes stepped toward Celeste to pour her a glass of vintage Margaux, a red wine the Royces reserved for special occasions. Her hand was steady, eyes fixed on the glass, a movement she'd repeated thousands of times. But Celeste, as if by accident, shifted her elbow just as Agnes approached. The wine spilled. The red liquid splashed across her champagne-colored silk gown, the stain instantly blooming like an unmistakable mark. The room went silent for exactly 1 second. Celeste slowly rose, looked down at the stain, then up, her eyes sliding past Agnes, not angry, but like someone who had just executed a planned checkmate. "Oh, it's fine, really," she said, her voice soft as a breeze. "After all, it's just a dress, although it is such a shame. This one was a one-of-a-kind piece from Milan." Agnes stepped back, momentarily startled, but quickly composed herself. She reached for a napkin and gently began to dab the fabric. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Marjorie looked up, eyes sharpening. James set down his cutlery, gaze half amused, half expectant. Nathaniel hesitated. "It was probably just an accident, Celeste. Agnes would never." "I know," Celeste cut him off, turning away. "I'm just not used to being served so intimately." Dinner went on, but no one had much appetite left. Agnes quietly excused herself without a word of protest. After the meal, Nathaniel found Agnes in the small utility room behind the kitchen, hand-washing the stained apron. He froze. She kept working the yellow bulb, casting a soft light over her wrinkled but steady hands. "Agnes," he said. "I'm fine," she replied without turning. "No need to explain, young master." Nathaniel bit his lip. For the first time, something in his eyes cracked like a shard of childhood memory, falling to the floor and shattering. The next day, the atmosphere in the Royce house seemed frozen. Even as sunlight poured through the arched windows, lighting up the old oak tables and thick wool rugs, something heavy and hushed drifted in the air, as if the house was holding its breath. Agnes did not appear at breakfast. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, stirring his coffee without taking a sip. Marjorie read the paper as usual, but now and then she glanced at her nephew. James arrived late, as carefree as always, but his eyes never left the empty seat to the right where Agnes usually sat when dining with the family. Celeste, by contrast, was unusually radiant. She spoke of redecorating the main sitting room. "Darling, I think the room would be perfect if we replaced the green velvet drapes with white linen. It would feel so much lighter." Nathaniel didn't respond. Marjorie offered a dry remark. "White linen doesn't hold dust, and this house has never been afraid of shadows, Celeste." Celeste smiled as if she hadn't heard a thing. At noon, Nathaniel quietly stepped into the library. His favorite room as a child was where he used to sit and read for hours at Agnes's feet as she cleaned or embroidered by the window. He wasn't there for books. He was looking for Agnes, but she wasn't there. He walked down the north wing corridor, the path leading to the servants' quarters. It had been a long time since he last set foot here. Everything was tidy and clean, but too quiet. The quiet that comes from someone who has decided to step back. He stopped in front of a door with a small photo frame above it, an old picture of a curly-haired boy hugging a puppy standing beside a warm-eyed, dark-skinned woman. Below is the photo in faded handwriting, Nat and Agnes. Summer 2000. He knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. It wasn't locked. Inside the small room, Agnes was sitting on the edge of her bed, back slightly hunched, hands clasped together. On the table was an old brown suitcase open. Some items had already been packed: handkerchiefs, a small notebook, a silver picture frame. Nathaniel was suddenly pulled back to age 8 the first time he saw Agnes packing her bags. Back then, she'd threatened to leave after he'd mischievously burned books in the library. He'd sobbed until he hiccuped, clung to her legs, and promised never to upset her again. This time, he stood still, and she didn't cry. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice tight. Agnes didn't look at him. She answered gently, "I think it's time. I don't belong at wine dinners or among people who can't tell the difference between an accident and intent. Celeste will come around. She needs time. You don't need to defend her." She turned to him, her eyes warm but sad. "I understand what it feels like not to be welcome. It's not that you hate me," she interrupted, her tone calm. "It's that you forgot who I am in this house." Nathaniel wanted to say something. He wanted to apologize, to beg her to stay, to hold her the way he did when he was 11, delirious with fever, and she'd sat by his bed all night, cooling his forehead and humming soft Creole lullabies. But his mouth froze. Agnes gently placed her hand over his. "You're a good man, Nat, but even good men must know when to stand on the right side, not the convenient one." That night, Agnes was no longer in the house. Her room was locked. Celeste stepped into the sitting room, draped in a flowing silk gown, tilting her head. "So, she's gone at last." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing. A week after Agnes left, the Royce estate seemed to have a new owner in truth. Celeste began her reforms. She replaced the curtains in the library with rippling white silk. The classic vintage sofas were removed from the storage room and replaced with sleek modern Italian chairs. The ancestral portraits of the Royce family, including the late Count Edmund Royce, were taken down, wrapped, and sent straight to the basement. In their place were abstract paintings commissioned from a Manhattan gallery. Nathaniel said nothing, not because he wasn't bothered, but because he couldn't yet bring himself to touch the most significant absence of all: the empty seat in the kitchen, the missing scent of lavender lingering near the porch, and the Creole lullabies that had vanished. That night, Celeste hosted a dinner party, elegant, calculated, and full of unfamiliar people who stepped into the Royce manor as though they were the rightful owners. Champagne flowed endlessly. Electronic music thundered through the grand hall, once reserved only for cello sonatas and nocturnes. Marjorie did not attend. James was present, but stood silently by the staircase holding a glass of brandy, his gaze alert. Then it happened. A platinum-blonde woman, lips painted blood red, let out a shrill laugh as she pointed at a crooked old painting in the hallway. "God, the old woman in this frame looks more like a nanny than a noblewoman." Celeste laughed unapologetically. "Well, she was. That's the last portrait of Nanny Agnes. Nathaniel wanted to keep it for sentimental reasons, but I find it terribly out of place." The air around them went still for a moment. James placed his glass on the table. He walked straight into the center of the room. "Careful, Celeste. Some shadows, when stepped on, have a way of returning." Celeste tilted her head. "Is that a warning? A reminder?" He replied, voice calm. "That you shouldn't challenge what you don't understand." In the corner of the room, a young maid, Lila, trembled as she carried a tray of wine. Celeste glanced over, frowning. "Does she not know how to walk properly? We need trained staff, not shy country girls." Lila lowered her head. From the second-floor balcony, Nathaniel stood watching everything. and he realized just how right Agnes had been down to the bone. "It's not because you hate me. It's because you forgot who I was in this house." Celeste didn't hate Agnes. She never saw her. Just as now, she did not see anyone who didn't fit her aesthetic vision. When the party ended, Nathaniel stepped out into the garden. The wind was cold, but inside him a fire raged. He remembered the way Agnes would gently touch his shoulder when he panicked. He remembered how she once whispered to him, "Being a good person isn't hard. What's hard is choosing which side to stand on." This time, he would not choose silence. 2 days after the party, the tension in the Royce household hung tight like a taut wire. Celeste still moved through the estate like a queen, her long, slender fingers pointing out small things to change from flower vases to tablecloth colors. But the household staff had started whispering about the way she commanded them as if they were pieces of furniture. Her gaze always passed over their heads, never meeting their eyes, about how she disregarded everything Agnes had once put into place. That afternoon in this kitchen, Leela, the young maid, was preparing a tea tray in the old style, a silver teapot, embroidered napkins, cinnamon butter cookies, just like Agnes had taught her. Celeste entered. White silk blouse, high heels clicked a cold rhythm on the stone floor. "Who told you to bring this outdated tea tray to my room?" Celeste asked, her voice dry. Lila stammered, I thought it was the usual. Mrs. Agnes used to Agnes is no longer here." Celeste cut in, reached out whether by accident or design, and swept the tray aside. The silver tilted. The teacup spilled. Hot, pale brown tea splashed across Celeste's white silk blouse, leaving a deep stain that spread like ink on snow. For a moment, the entire kitchen held its breath. Celeste stood frozen for a second. Then she slowly looked down at her blouse. When she lifted her eyes, they burned cold with fury. "What did you just do?" Lila trembled. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I'll clean it right. Clean it." Celeste laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You think you can scrub Italian silk because you've spent the past year scrubbing kitchen floors." At that moment, Nathaniel walked in. He took in the scene, the overturned tray, the dark tea stain. Lila froze, Celeste, seething. "What's going on?" he asked, calm but edging like a thin blade. Celeste turned, feigning lightness. "Just a small accident. But it's time to reconsider our staff. Shaky hands shouldn't carry silver." Lila tried to hold back tears. She bowed her head and started to walk away. "Lila," Nathaniel said, not even glancing at Celeste, "you didn't do anything wrong. Go rest upstairs. I'll speak to Aunt Marjorie." Celeste spun around. "Whose side are you on?" And for the first time, he didn't deflect. He didn't hesitate. He didn't choose silence. "I'm on the side of the last bit of kindness still left in this house." Celeste's mouth fell open, not from shock, but because she never imagined Nathaniel would finally push back. That evening, the dining room felt glacial. Marjorie stayed silent throughout dinner, but the glance she gave Nathaniel held quiet approval. James, as usual, just shook his head and smirked. "Well, the wind has changed direction." Celeste poured her wine, her hand slightly trembling, but her voice remained sharp. "If everyone here wants to keep clinging to emotional remnants of the past, I won't stand in the way." "They're not remnants," Nathaniel said, setting down his glass. "They're the foundation." That night, after dinner, as cold as stone, Nathaniel wandered the long corridors of the Astor estate. The ground floor was silent, lit only by the wall sconces casting golden light against oak-paneled walls and the steady tick of the grandfather clock echoing in the darkness. He stopped in front of an old photograph hanging in the east corridor, a place few paid attention to anymore. In the photo was a boy around 7 years old, thin, messy-haired, sitting dwarfed in a large leather chair. Beside him was a woman in an old-fashioned maid's uniform, hair neatly pinned, a face stern yet kind. Agnes. Nathaniel raised a hand and gently touched the glass. He remembered that moment. The picture had been taken on his 7th birthday, the day his parents were entertaining guests in New York, and Marjorie had gone out to handle a legal matter. Agnes had cut the cake-hung balloons and bought him an old fairy tale book using 3 weeks of her wages. "Do you remember that day?" His voice echoed softly down the empty corridor. No one answered, but something in his chest sank. Instinctively, he pulled a chair over and sat beneath the photograph, his eyes still fixed on Agnes's face in the wooden frame. Why had I stayed silent for so long? Why did it take 2 spilled cups of tea before I finally stood up? There was something in his chest. Not guilt. Fear. Fear of confronting Celeste. Fear of seeing the true nature of the person he had chosen too clearly. Fear of admitting that he, the boy Agnes had once shielded and raised with kindness, had let her be wounded under the roof they once shared. A slight sound made him turn. Lila stood a few steps away, arms wrapped around a basket of tablecloths, eyes red. She was startled when she saw him. "Sorry. I just meant to come in." Nathaniel's voice softened. "Have you ever seen this photo before?" Lila shook her head. He pointed at the woman in the photo. "Agnes raised me, not just with meals and pressed clothes, but by teaching me the difference between right and wrong, and how to defend what's right, even when no one else will." Lila lowered her eyes and visibly moved. "I let her be hurt for too long. Starting tomorrow, things will be different." The next morning, while Celeste was reviewing the staff list, part of her proposed streamlining for reform, a photograph appeared on the dining table placed neatly on her porcelain plate. It was the picture of Agnes and Nathaniel as a child. On the back, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, "Some people cannot be replaced, and some memories should never be erased." That day, the Astor estate was no longer as silent as it used to be. There was something in the air, as if the old oak-paneled walls had begun to whisper, not in words, but unmistakably, and no one could pretend not to hear. The morning after the photograph appeared on the breakfast table, Celeste showed up with a frozen smile. But everyone noticed her lips pressed tighter than usual, and her glance toward Agnes was no longer calm. And then the whispers started, not from Agnes, nor from Nathaniel, but from the gardener, the old cook, the boy who helped in the library, people who had seemed voiceless until now. I saw it clearly. The first time was deliberate. The second time left no doubt. Master Nathaniel isn't staying silent anymore, you hear? The name Agnes was no longer a quiet shadow in the small kitchen in the linen storage room, even in the old stables at the back of the garden. She had become the center of stories, a living symbol of loyalty and silence taken advantage of. That evening, Celeste entered the sitting room. Agnes was organizing old books according to a classification system she had created over a decade ago. "I need to speak with you," Celeste said, her tone smooth but cold. Agnes didn't look up. She replied calmly, "I'm listening." Celeste stepped forward, placing her hand on the back of the velvet chair. "I don't think you should remain here." There was no shouting, no insult, just a blow aimed straight at one's dignity, wrapped in sweet, false politeness. Agnes looked at her gaze steady and unflinching. "I've lived here since before you could pronounce the name of this house." Celeste's lips tightened, but Agnes continued speaking for the first time in years, with a voice that no longer tolerated. "I taught Nathaniel how to tie his shoes. I soothed him through nightmares. I stood at the door when his parents fought in the middle of the night. What do you think I am? An old piece of furniture?" Celeste was stunned for a moment, then turned away without answering. Elsewhere in the house, in a low-ceilinged room near the laundry, Lila sat with Nathaniel, the spot she often came to when her heart felt heavy. "She wants to get rid of her, doesn't she?" Lila asked. Nathaniel nodded. "I won't let that happen." Lila hesitated, then said softly, I overheard something yesterday, while cleaning the glass near the main hall. What did you hear, Miss Celeste? She told someone from the city they would restructure the estate management, not just reform it, but erase every trace of the old ways. She said Agnes was the last trace. Nathaniel clenched his fists. What are they planning to replace everyone? Bring in their people. The old cook Tom from the stables. All of them. That night, Agnes was summoned to Marjorie's office. But instead of a fair discussion, she was handed an envelope. A termination letter. The reason listed was staff restructuring due to a change in management direction. No words of thanks. Not a second of regret. She left the room in silence. But in her eyes, there was fire. The next morning at a breakfast heavy with silence, Marjorie announced Agnes will be leaving next week. Please prepare to welcome a new housekeeper from the city. No one said a word, but Nathaniel put down his teacup and stood. No, she's not going anywhere. Marjorie's eyes widened. Celeste went pale. James pressed his lips together in anticipation. Nathaniel looked at his mother, then turned to Celeste, his eyes now firm and clear. If someone has to leave this place, it won't be the woman who raised me. Sometimes the turning point of a family doesn't arrive with shouting. It begins at a silent breakfast. One person stands and never sits again. She's not going anywhere. Nathaniel's words were quiet, yet struck like a hammer. The entire table fell into stunned silence. Marjorie set down her teacup. Celeste looked at him as though she had misheard. James half smiled, half concealed a sigh of relief. Nathaniel Marjorie finally spoke, after a suffocating pause. You don't understand. No, Mother. He cut her off for the first time in years. You're the one who doesn't understand. Agnes is the only person still holding this house's soul together. This isn't something to be decided by emotion. It's an organizational restructuring. Organizational. Nathaniel gave a bitter laugh. So, are we talking about a family or a corporation? Mother? No one responded. At that very moment in the small room where Agnes had lived for nearly 30 years, she was folding her uniforms slowly, precisely, just like she used to fold Nathaniel's blankets each crisp autumn morning. You can't just leave like this, said Lila, standing at the door, her eyes red. You haven't even finished telling the story about the missing gray dog. Agnes smiled gently. Old folks, we must learn when it's time to leave the stage. But this isn't your fault. Agnes turned to her eyes, gentle, but resolute. The fault doesn't lie in the silence of the servant Lila. It lies with those raised to speak, but who chose to stay quiet. Lila lowered her head, but she didn't step away. In the reading room, Marjorie opened an old wooden drawer, pulling out a faded photograph. Nathaniel, 5 years old, is sitting in Agnes's lap. Both were laughing brightly. Below is a handwritten caption, the ink smudged over time. My boy always. She closed her eyes, remembering the day her husband died. Agnes had been there keeping Nathaniel from panicking and her from falling apart. And now she had allowed an outsider, someone who had never known actual loss, to erase all of that. Her hand clenched, but she didn't rise from her chair. James knocked on Agnes's door. Do you remember when I ran away and slept in the stables for 3 nights? You lost nearly 4 pounds in those 3 nights. Only you remember that. James sat on the edge of the bed watching Lila quietly folding shirts. I've done a lot of foolish things. But if I let you leave like this without saying anything, this would be the stupidest of them all. He looked at Agnes, then stood pulling out his phone. You don't have to do anything. I'll make a mess if I have to. Agnes sighed. Don't make a mess, James. Just do what's right. That evening after dinner, Nathaniel walked into the study where Marjorie was reviewing papers. You can keep financial control if that makes you feel secure, he said. But I want authority over personnel decisions. I want to take charge of staff management in this house. Marjorie looked up. Are you sure? More sure than I've ever been. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Not because she was convinced, but because for the first time she saw that the once fragile boy had grown up. The next morning, Nathaniel went to Agnes's room. You don't have to go, Mother agreed. Celeste will no longer interfere. Agnes smiled, but her eyes were different. Thank you, my boy. But I should go. Why? Because if I stay only to be forgiven, then I'm no longer myself. Nathaniel froze. There's one thing I need you to learn, she said softly. Sometimes, love isn't about holding on. It's about letting someone choose their path, even if that doesn't end with you. Agnes was gone. There was no farewell party, no tears. It was a quiet morning before the sun had fully crested the hill. The iron gates of Thorne's estate closed behind her with a soft click, barely a sound, but enough to make the great house feel as if it had lost a part of its soul. The new assistant baker followed the recipe exactly. The right amount of butter, the perfect temperature. But everyone took one bite and set their pastries down. It's not the same, Leela whispered to James. The taste is right, but the scent is different. James said nothing. But that morning, he stood a long while in the empty kitchen, staring at the jar that used to hold the wooden spoons Agnes always used, now cold to the touch. Celeste, who believed she had won, felt a strange unrest in her chest. The bedroom now felt more silent than ever, because the woman who changed the linens no longer left behind sprigs of lavender on the pillows, or the tiny notes reminding me, "Don't leave the south window open. Crosswinds." She was just a maid, Celeste told herself. And yet, as she sat on the bed and looked around, she felt for the first time out of place in the very kingdom she had once longed to rule. Marjorie walked into the reading room with the armchair where Agnes used to knit on cold winter nights. She sat down. But the backrest no longer felt warm. She pulled out an old photo album and paused at one picture Agnes is holding Nathaniel in her arms. And she, Marjorie herself, standing beside them, smiling. But not at the camera. She had been looking at Agnes. A single drop of water fell onto the clear photo sleeve. Lila brought tea to Nathaniel's room as Agnes had taught her. Not 3 knocks, not 2, just one firm and clear enough to let the person inside know without startling them. I want to keep learning what she started, she said softly, even if she's no longer here. Nathaniel looked at her and nodded silently. And when you've learned it all, he said, pass it on to the next person, so this place won't forget it once had light. A week later, James quietly hired workers to repair the overhang where Agnes used to water the flowers. No one had told him to. He also sent a portion of his income to the address Agnes had left behind, without a name or note. You don't need to know who it's from. Just know you're not alone. The estate outwardly remained unchanged. The flowers still bloomed. The curtains were still clean. Board meetings are still convened. But each night, Nathaniel still paused outside Agnes's old room when passing the western corridor. One evening, he stepped inside. The old alarm clock she left behind still sat on the table. He turned it on. The ticking resumed, soft, steady like a heartbeat. Nathaniel sat down, hand resting on the wood. I'm learning, you know. Learning how to keep the light. Agnes had left. But she left behind a quiet question for each person in the house. Is the true worth of a person measured by their title, or by the footprints they leave on the hearts of those who remain? The light in the estate no longer came from familiar hands. But the flame, the one Agnes had tended so quietly, had not gone out. It had been passed on, in many forms, through many people. One early morning, before anyone else in the house had stirred, Lila rose to light the fireplace in the west wing. The place where Agnes once said, Don't let it get cold in the mornings. There the draft can make Miss Marjorie's joints ache. No one reminded her, but Lila remembered. She kept Agnes's old notebook, each line neatly handwritten, careful like a quiet map of love. She taped a note beside the storage room light switch, pressed gently old wiring. A new maid asked, "Why write all that? No one reads it." Lila smiled. Precisely because no one reads it. Someone has to write it. James often padded through the back garden, the one Agnes once called the calmest place for sorting out tangled thoughts. Once he sat there with Nathaniel. "I don't think we ever truly understood her," Nathaniel said. James nodded. "But we were loved anyway, without needing to." James proposed building a small memorial wall in the garden. No name, no photo, just one engraved line for the one who saw everything yet never asked to be seen. On one rainy afternoon, the woman who had always stood tall called Lila into her room. "I've never apologized to anyone," Marjorie began. "But perhaps this is the right time." Lila, flustered, didn't get a chance to reply. Marjorie handed her a stack of old papers, Agnes's work notes for her successor. She left it all, even though no one told her she had to. Then she stood slowly. "Keep it, and when you're ready, pass it on. Celeste," who once saw Agnes as a shadow one day. I opened a small drawer while redecorating the sitting room. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Familiar handwriting. Ms. Celeste likes cream-colored tablecloths, though she's never said so. I've set aside a set in case she needs it for a private dinner. Agnes. Celeste stared at the words for a long time, then quietly sat down and began writing a list of all the staff in the house whose names she had never learned. She began to study. A few weeks after Agnes left, Nathaniel paused a management meeting. He told everyone to wait, then returned with a wooden box. "This is Agnes's notebook. Inside is the complete household operation plan season by season. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was the memory of this home." He looked around the room. "If we don't preserve it, it's not the place that will fall apart, but the things that once made it home." A letter with no return address arrived at the estate, only marked on the envelope, "To those I once loved." Inside were trembling lines of ink. "I'm doing well. The garden's first onions have come in. I don't hope to be remembered. I only hope that you don't forget how to remember kindness." At the end of the letter, in neat script, "A lamp doesn't stay lit on its own, but if someone lights it again, the light will never be lost." No bells were tolling to mark anything special. No grand events. No official memos or announcements. It was just another morning, except for the way the light filtered through the window that day. It hit the floor a little differently. Lila was walking past the main hallway when she saw James bending down to straighten a slightly crooked rug. "It's a rare sight. You don't need to do that." "Let me," she said. James smiled. "Sister Agnes used to tell me not to kick the rug when I was little. Guess I'm fixing it now to make up for it late." Lila chuckled, then softly asked, "She's still here, isn't she?" James nodded. "In the way we're not letting everything fall apart like before." That afternoon, Marjorie, the woman who had once been cold to everyone, made an unexpected suggestion. "Let's have dinner in the back kitchen tonight, like when Agnes used to cook for the children." Everyone was surprised. No one objected. In the old kitchen, the smell of soup rose in curling steam. The toast was slightly burnt around the edges, precisely the way Agnes used to make it. Nathaniel pulled out an old wooden stool and placed it beside the table. "That's Agnes's seat." No one sat there, but whenever someone shared a funny story, they glanced in that direction. The household choreboard now had a new line. "Add whatever you think should be done, even if no one told you to." A notebook was placed in the foyer, open for anyone to write in. Each note, from "clean the windows more thoroughly" to "change the evening music to her favorite piece," was a shard of memory gently gathered. No one said it had to be done. But people did it. It was as natural as if it had always been that way. No one knew who had sent it. No name. No return address. A small envelope was sealed and placed on the sitting room tea table. The words on the front read, "For those who still remember how the kitchen light was always left on for the last one to come in." Inside was a small slip of paper. A house isn't made of bricks and walls, but of how we remember one another without needing names. Keep the flame. One afternoon, while Lila was polishing the southern hallway windows, a little boy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Lila, who's Agnes? I heard Uncle James say she used to know all the hiding spots for cookies in the house." Lila laughed and knelt. "That's right. And she also knew how to keep the light shining the brightest, without needing anyone to remind her." "Like you now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, then answered, "Not like her, but I'm learning." No statues were erected. No biographies were written. No tales told of Agnes as a legend. But no one forgot, because they lived in a way that preserved what Agnes once tended. A home that needs no name is still a home, as long as someone is paying attention to the light, to the tiny scratch on the stair railing, to the one cup someone always uses when they're tired. And when such things are passed on through each pair of hands, each step taken, then the one who left never truly left at all.